to Day 2 of the Africa Economic Symposium, organized by the Policy Center for the New South. The theme of this year's edition is Fostering Africa's Economic Transformation through Innovative Financing. Our first session this morning and third session of the symposium will focus on navigating financial resource limitations amidst growing economic development needs. Please join me in welcoming to the stage our chair for this panel, Arkebe Oqubay Metiku, former senior minister and special advisor to the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. And now, please welcome to the stage our speakers for this panel. Nagesh Kumar, Director and Chief Executive at the Institute for Studies in Industrial Development. Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi, Executive Vice President at the African Center for Economic Transformation. And Taffere Tesfachew, Senior Advisor at Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Before giving the floor to the chair for this session, we will view a short introductory video for the panel.
Africa faces critical financial resources gaps amid growing development needs. From building essential infrastructure and fostering technological innovation, to ensuring a just transition to renewable energy and meeting the social needs of a growing population, the imperative for financial resources to navigate these complexities and drive development progress is becoming increasingly urgent. However, financial development alone is insufficient. Effective governance plays an equally important role in maximizing the impact of financial resources. What are the four most important development challenges facing Africa? How can Africa's financial landscape be reshaped to address these challenges in a more inclusive manner? What policies and initiatives can be implemented to enhance governance and maximize the role of finance in addressing Africa's development challenges?
Arkebe Oqubay Metiku, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Today is day 2. Yesterday, we have looked at macroeconomic issues. And today's sessions are going to be related to that specific issue. But this year's African Economic Symposium central theme is financing and development, and particularly fostering development and also innovative financing schemes. So this morning's session will be followed by various sessions on this central theme. We have excellent panelists today, and allow me to use their first name. Nagesh is a professor, and he is head of an Institute of Studies on Industrial Development, so central to structural transformation, and he has been playing executive roles in many UN agencies, and we are honored to have him. And we'll be listening also some perspective from experiences in Asia. And then we have Mavis. She is the president and CEO of African Center for Economic Transformation, which is one of the leading think tanks in this continent. And she has also been working close to 2 decades in international development agencies at DFID. So rich experience, we are going to hear a lot. And we also have Tesfachew, who is a veteran of UNCTAD. He has been at UNCTAD for over 25 years, responsible for developing countries and least developing countries. And we'll be hearing a lot of insights from Tesfachew. Allow me to thank the host, the Policy Center for the New South, as it has emerged one of the leading think tanks in our continent. And its 10th-year anniversary, and we must congratulate them. And can we clap once? It's doing a wonderful contribution to the continent, and we wish a brighter decade ahead. So this morning's session links financing resources and innovative financing with economic transformation or structural transformation or productive transformation. And if we look the long-term perspective in our continent, in the last 50 years, the economy has been growing at on average 3.5%. And at global level, average growth has been 3.1%. But this is lower than Asian average, which was about 4.9% in the last 50 years. So this brings an issue to look at the lagging structural transformation in our continent in terms of productive capability, exports, and also economic diversification. It also leads us to look at the future path. We shouldn't only talk about crisis. We should also look at the future trend, and one of the central drivers of economic growth in the coming decades is going to be demography. Demography and technology are the key determinant of long-term growth, and Africa's population will double. Over 1 billion will be living in urban centers, and also over 800 million will be joining workforce. So this is a huge opportunity, and also it could be a tsunami. Then we live in a global context, and volatile and also crisis, as we have seen 2009, financial crisis. We have seen it in 2015, the price shock in commodities, and also 2020, COVID, followed by recession. So this session, I believe, will help to share insights on this important topic. Let's start. Let me invite everyone this interactive session to use smartphones. And the first question is, what is the primary development challenge facing Africa? We'll give you 5 seconds. Okay, done? Yeah, so we could see the outcome, and we'll see how it evolves during the session. Now I will invite the panelists, and let me start with Mavis. And the first question that 3 of them will be dealing is, what are the foremost development challenges facing Africa? And how can Africa's financial landscape be reshaped to address these challenges in a more inclusive manner? Mavis.
Thank you very much, Arkebe, and thank you also to the Policy Center. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. Can you hear me now? So thank you very much, Arkebe, and thank you to the Policy Center for the New South for the invitation to join this panel. For ASET, the biggest issue is on the continent right now is the lack of economic transformation. As human beings, we are ultimately all working for our human well-being. We are looking for jobs, decent jobs that will pay well, that will enable us to educate our children, etc. That's what we are all working towards. And for most African economies, this will only be achieved if they transform their economies and they increase access to finance for further development. Economic transformation at Asset, we define it as growth with depth. So the depth starts for diversification of your economy, export competitiveness, improved productivity, effective use of technology, all leading to human capital. And we actually measure how countries are progressing towards this definition of transformation. The last report we released, the Africa Transformation Index, was last year. And the index looked at 30 countries that represent, in effect, 86.5% of the continent's GDP. So a very substantive number of the continent. And out of a score of 100, our transformation score in over 2000 to 2020 was 30.3. It ranged from countries like Tunisia at 69.5 out of 100 to Niger and Burundi at 11.9. So we are not transforming as effectively as we should. When we unpacked the data, we were really worried about two things. We are actually regressing on economic transformation, economic diversification as a continent, and we are regressing on export competitiveness. So when we looked at the scores for economic diversification, we had dropped over the 20 years to 5.9 points, and when we looked at export competitiveness, we had dropped by 0.9 points. And this is highly problematic if you look at how we are growing. The pace at which we are growing is showing us that, in effect, what's happening is that the little transformation that's happening is happening by default rather than design. We are not intentionally using growth to diversify our economies. Growth is pulling up diversification. And then we also looked at the link between transformation and resilience. And this is really important because we've seen a lot of shocks as a continent. And yesterday, a number of our panelists kept talking about how slow we are to rebound from shocks. So when we look at countries like Tunisia, Morocco, Mauritius, that actually made positive progress against economic diversification and export competitiveness. We compared how they fared during the 2007 global financial crisis and the 2014-2015 commodity super cycle. And these countries actually buckled slower than the others and rebounded faster. So if we are going to get out of this boom-bust cycle that we are in, we need to be intentional on how we actually transform our economies. Now, everybody's telling us we don't have enough money. How are we going to do it? It's highly problematic. That intentionality requires us to pick value chains and invest in those value chains. So follow the whole value chain. We can't do infrastructure perfectly everywhere. Pick a value chain across regions and make it work. Pick a sector and make it work. So, chocolate. I come from Ghana, okay? This is Bioko chocolate. And I'm actually gonna leave it here for everybody to taste. Bioko makes excellent chocolate, but they are stuck at the niche market because their inputs are so expensive. And guess where they are importing their inputs from? North America, Europe, and Asia. But guess what's happening? The milk is being actually sold to North America from Ethiopia and the Sahel, okay? The sugar is being sold from Africa, and then Bioko is importing it in. Bioko will never compete effectively. Now imagine, it's not that she wants to be a niche chocolatier. It's the only place she can actually stay at. Now imagine if we were intentional in this industry, built a regional value chain, made it work. It would be very, very different. Bioko would still be able to develop her niche chocolate, but also create mass production, generate decent jobs, etc., etc. I always wear an African outfit. Today's skirt, from sub-Saharan Africa, niche market, high-end industry. Imported in. We ship cotton from West Africa. You could. Okay. So, okay. You can see the scale better now. So we ship cotton from West Africa to Asia. We buy bales of cotton, we print it, and then we sell it. And it's a niche market. And when we mass produce with cheap fabric from China. There's something fundamentally wrong with our model. We have the worst care economy in the world. I mean, we don't need infrastructure for this. We just need training. We could build one of the best care economies in the world, use it effectively in Africa, and export it. So, very quickly on the second part of the question, where is the money coming from? We've spoken a lot about the global financial architecture. I want us to look domestically. We can get money by being smarter in how we spend our money. So, digital public infrastructure, we've been talking about this for decades, and we're still not making progress on it. I'm very envious. India implemented a digital public infrastructure program and is currently saving $1 billion a month just from that one action. Where is our equivalent? If we look at things like efficiency of public investment, we are inefficient in our public investment. We are looking at a recent study that was done showed that we have an average inefficiency gap of 39% on the continent, ranging from almost 0% in Rwanda to 70% in Nigeria and Angola. So imagine if we were more efficient in how we spend our money. Let's plug holes in illicit financial flows. Everybody keeps talking about the Mbeki 2015 report. But when we look at the results, implementation has been almost non-existent. We can't keep talking about these things. We say our pension funds are not investing in the continent. Where are the projects, the viable projects that they should invest in? None of us want our pensions to be wasted. And then we have African financial institutions. They need to do more to optimize their own balance sheets. They need to collaborate, work more effectively with national development banks to really invest in our economies. And last but definitely not least, we must do a much, much better job of monetizing our green assets. And the plea here is, let's not do this nation state by nation state. Let's do this as a region so that we can compete effectively with the rest of the world. Thank you.
Tesfachew.
Thank you very much, Arkebe. Good morning. Let me first thank the organizers, the center, for inviting me. I'll try to build on what Mavis was talking about, structural transformation. But let's start with good news first. Last 3 decades, we have seen some growth and economic development in Africa. Growth in some cases even double-digit level, as Arkebe will tell you, because he was one of the architects of the economic development in Ethiopia, and there were other countries like Angola as well growing at 11%, 10%, which is really very high. If a country grows at around 7, 8 a year for about 10 years, the GDP doubles. So growth is very important. However, despite this growth and economic development, the pace and quality of economic transformation has been limited, as Mavis highlighted. And there are many reasons, and since we don't have much time, I will focus on 2 of them, and they will explain exactly, in my view, why this transformation taking place in Africa has been very limited, and it's very interesting in the initial interactive thing that you highlight. Yeah. In the interactive thing they did, they highlighted economic diversification, export, employment, infrastructure. That's very interesting. These are very, very critical. So I would argue that the reason why the economic transformation, despite growth, has been limited to two factors. There are many, but let me highlight two. One of them is, I would say, the limited or weak productive capacity development in Africa is one of them. The second one is a failure to achieve improvement in productivity. Now, the first, productive capacity, is important because it determines what African countries are capable of producing, goods and services that they can either consume domestically or export. The second productivity issue is important because it determines the depth and quality of structural transformation. Productivity is very important. Now, let me say something about product capacity. I mean, explain what I mean. Product capacities, I would argue, are important. This is something actually at UNCTAD we worked for many years because these are the wide range of technological and production capabilities and competencies ranging from skills, development of private sector, institutions, human capital development, infrastructure development, industrial policy, level of public investment, all this together that a country needs to be able to produce a wide range of goods and services that it can consume domestically or export competitively. At the end of the day, what distinguishes developed from developing countries is the level of development of their productive capacity. If you ask the question, why is it that some countries produce, like Korea, let's take example, they produce and export over 8,900 different products, from simple ones to technologically more sophisticated, high productivity, high value products, wide range of products they produce and export. And let's take another African country, like Angola, export one product. 94% of Angola's export is oil. The 6% is just a little bit of coffee and so on. Why is it? Because Korea has developed its product capacity, skills, technological other capabilities, and Angola hasn't. And this is very important. When there are financial crises, like the Asian one at the end of 90s, 2008-9, the financial crisis, and recently COVID and what followed. The difference between these two countries is that Korea will be able to export its way out of crisis because they are able to produce a wide range of products that others need, while Angola could come out of crisis only if oil prices goes up. If oil prices stays down, then they have to wait until oil prices go up, and because oil price is not determined by them. And that really defines, in a simple way, for me, what this product capacity is. And having product capacity enables you to do a wide range of things. You can diversify your economy, create well-paying jobs, move into manufacturing, technological learning, and find markets, and produce increasingly more sophisticated products, because what countries produce and export matters very much. Sorry about that. If you are the producer and exporter of commodities, and you're exporter and producer of manufacturing goods, the income you have is different. With manufacturing goods, with industrialization, you can upgrade. You can always do structural transformation, move up the value, the productivity, the technology ladder to be able to earn more. So I think this is very important. And time is not, I can see the time running there, but the lack of product capacity in Africa was glaringly shown or exposed during the COVID. If you remember that there was a panic, many countries needed PPEs, simple products to stop the spread of the virus, like masks, gowns for doctors and so on. And there was a high demand. And countries that have the product capacity to produce them start stopping export because they need them for themselves. The countries in Africa who don't have the capacity to produce these products were in trouble. They can't even import it because countries have imposed restrictions, export restrictions. Even if they can import it, foreign exchange is not there. So I think it was a wake-up call for many countries in Africa that if you don't do something about your product capacity, your capability to be able to produce a wide range of products that you need to consume and export, you will continue not to achieve much in terms of economic transformation. Now, in terms of the finance, I think the most important source of financing, obviously, is domestic resource mobilization. If you can raise resources domestically that you need for financing, it sorry about that. Yeah, it gives you a lot of policy space. You'll be able to spend your finances in productive sectors, in social and other areas, infrastructure, as you wish, because this is resources you mobilize. When you rely on external financing, it's not that always that easy. So since we don't have time, let's just simply highlight that domestic resource mobilization is absolutely critical. Unfortunately, in many African countries, it has remained very low. I think about 17% or so of GDP is a revenue that governments collect internally, compared to 40%, 30 to 40% in many developed countries, and around 25-30% as emerging economies. So that's one area. Among very quickly, the external financing, let me highlight two of them. One of them is FDI. Now, we know why countries need FDI. It's very clear. It's assumed that FDI, when you attract it, it comes with technology, it brings capital, it brings knowledge, it employs people, and it creates production capacity. Hopefully also it opens up export markets. Now, but one thing we have to be sure, so there are positive things, I have to emphasize that first. But what I want to say is that I think it's a mistake to assume that the presence of FDI alone is enough to generate all these benefits. It's not automatic. In this case, policy matters. How you engage with FDI matters. What kind of FDI you attract matters. Now, the problem with FDI in Africa, let me mention a couple of them. One of them is that it's concentrated, as Owusu was saying from IMF yesterday, in the extractive sector. Naturally, they want the raw material. What's wrong with that? Well, nothing wrong, because they are extracting these raw materials and exporting it, and hopefully royalties they pay. But generally, they tend to be enclave operations. They just come to extract the raw material and export it, and generally, many studies show you that there are limited linkages. Value addition doesn't take place. If value addition does take place, it means they're not employing a lot of people, and more importantly, structural transformation is not happening. Because this when they start processing these raw materials, that they start introducing technology, technological learning, or the linkages come. So that's one problem. And the second problem, and there are many studies showing this, is that to attract FDI, increasingly countries are giving them generous incentives, 10-year tax exemption, free import of inputs and so on they need. That's really too generous. It's not unusual, 5% of GDP. Because incentive is given to multinationals. That is the problem. The third one is something you mentioned, the illicit financial flows. And there are studies by UNCTAD, ECA, UNDP, and of course the Mbeki report as well, highlighting that this type of operations allow for mispricing and misinvoicing of services, and aggressive tax avoidance happens. There are figures like 89 to 90 billion that Africa needs. I think I'm being told that the time is up, so better stop here. But I think my message simply is that the product capacity is very, very important. And if countries in Africa do not build their product capacity, structural transformation will not take place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tess. And one additional message Tesfachew was highlighting was at the center of economic transformation or structural transformation comes productive capability, productive transformation. And I should acknowledge one of the international organizations that had consistently produced reviews and studies for almost 40 years has been UNCTAD. And we are also honored that Richard is here, who has been producing all these trade and development reports. So thank you so much, Mavis and Tess, you have given us light. Now we have a friend from beyond Africa, and Asia has been at the frontier of this, actually a driver of global transformation, now contributing over 60% of global economic growth is driven by Asia. And we are privileged to have Nagesh with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arkebe. First of all, I must say that it's a privilege to be part of this very important discussion, very important conference, and I'm very impressed with what I have seen over the past 2 days. The Policy Center, the group of people that are assembled. So for that, and the 10th anniversary, so I want to really congratulate the Policy Center, Dr. Karim, and all of your team for this fabulous achievement. Now, this discussion about the productive capacity and structural transformation, I think this is the crux of economic development that we know. Over time, as countries evolve in their development journey, they need to move forward from low productivity activities to higher and more modern areas of productivity, as both Mavis and Tess were talking about. And that transformation, has been happening in different countries, but in very different contexts and different shapes. Some have gone from agriculture to manufacturing sector, like in East Asian countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, the latest one, Vietnam is following the same example. And some have moved from agriculture to services, and within services, some more productivity services, some low productivity services. And in that context, I think there are many similarities between India's development trajectory and Africa's development trajectory. And that creates some space for cooperation. So that is what I would, spend my few minutes on, in this session. I think, first of all, we should recognize there are two similarities between African economies and India. Both are passing through what is called as demographic dividend phase or youth bulge phase in their demographic transition. So a lot of youthful workforce is going to come from either countries in South Asia, especially India, and Africa. And that has a very important significance in the context of the rest of the world aging very fast. Japan is an aged society, Korea is aged society, China is aging very fast, so much so that the population is shrinking. And Europe much of Europe is in aged society. North America is also getting into the aging syndrome. So where will the workers come from? The workers of future will come from these two regions, and that is a very important point. However, I must also be quick to point out that demographic transition and it becoming a dividend, it becomes a dividend only when we invest in our youth. And there is another context, which is the new technology revolution, the AI-driven or the digital revolution or Industry 4.0, which is changing the nature of work. So a lot of people talk about the disruption it will have in the jobs market. And so people are worried about losing jobs. But there are many studies, including one by McKinsey's, which shows that this revolution is going to, of course, replace number of traditional routine kind of jobs, but it will create any in net terms, there will not be a disruption or loss of jobs, but maybe some addition, but different kinds of jobs. So there will be a huge demand of people who can do this coding and artificial intelligence, machine learning kind of. And these people, because rest of the world is aging very quickly, where will they come from? They will come from these regions. If we can invest into building and creating new engineers who are trained in coding, then we could supply all of these people and the job market disruption can be minimized. So this is one area where I think India and Africa can work together. India is also trying to help in building human resources and especially those trained in technology. What made India an IT superpower is that we had a clutch of institutions called IITs, Indian Institutes of Technology. And they have a very rigorous process of entry, but once you enter there, they are trained into finest engineers. Now, so practically any of the top IT professionals, anywhere one of these IITs. And the IITs have begun to kind of look at other countries to help them out. So for instance, IIT Madras or IIT Chennai has set up a campus in Zanzibar for helping the African countries as a part of India-Africa economic cooperation. And so I think there should be more such things happening. With IITs setting up, campuses, and African students going to Indian IITs and other institutions to get trained into these new technologies, and then the future belongs to us. The other similarities and contrasts that come to mind is that both India and Africa moved from agriculture to services, bypassing the manufacturing sector. And this is where, again, there are a lot of opportunities of catching up with the potential of manufacturing, which is important for creating jobs. And there, I think, there was a time when industrial policy was frowned upon, was becoming a very bad word. But now, in the past few years, some of the biggest champions of free trade, like United States, are pursuing industrial policy with such a vigorous and aggressive manner with CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act, and also $1.2 trillion of subsidies and tax breaks are being offered by United States government, which was the champion of free trade, free markets. And then this Washington Consensus, which was used to refer to liberalization, reforms, and all of that, is now used to refer to industrial policy. New Washington Consensus is about industrial policy. So I think this is a new era of building productive capacities and catching up with manufacturing sector. And fortunately, there is a new set of industries on the horizon we can leapfrog into, both India and African countries. For instance, the green industries. Green industrialization is something we can work together into. You have a lot of sunshine. Again, India is also trying to put a lot of resources into solar renewable energy, and there is International Solar Alliance built together or created together as an international organization by India and France, and that is helping developing countries, including in Africa, to harness their solar energy potential. There are many other industries which can leverage Africa's endowments of critical minerals, for instance, for building batteries and electric vehicles and all that. So there are immense possibilities now to catch up with potential of manufacturing for creating decent jobs, and potential of high productivity IT services, AI, ML, and all that. And I think South-South cooperation between countries in South, in Asia and Africa, working together to harness their potential would be very important going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nagesh. And I will invite the panelists to intervene for 2 minutes precisely. What policies and initiatives can be implemented to enhance governance and maximize the role of finance in addressing African development challenge? And I will each of you invite to share with us specific insights in 2, maximum 3 minutes. And before that, let's go to the interactive session. And each one of you, you may look at your smartphone, and the question for you will be, given Africa's financial resource limits, which financing source must play the primary role? Let's see the result. It's not showing? Okay. Is it showing? There are choices proposed where you can now question number 2. Question number 2 highlights the options: A, domestic resources and local development loans; B, productive FDI; C, multilateral concessional loans and ODA; D, bilateral concessional loans; E, remittance from citizens; F, external commercial loans. Unfortunately, the system doesn't allow 2 or 3. Ideally, we had wanted each one suggests 3, but I think you can choose one. Not coming? Okay, then let's move to, if it comes, then you can fill. And now let me give the floor to Mavis. It's okay. You may start to give him more time to think, Tess and Nagesh.
So very quickly, the first one is really agree a set of regional value chains that we are going to invest in, ensure that there's continuity of implementation. The stop-start is costing us too much money. The second one is around accountability. We need data to measure progress. What isn't measured isn't done. So we really need robust data to measure progress towards economic transformation. And the final one is we are a continent, but we live in a world. And I fundamentally believe that we need a much stronger and robust voice and vote for Africa in the global financial system. Not just a voice, but a vote. So about quotas, etc., so that what is being negotiated does benefit us.
Yeah. Can I continue? Okay. I think the results have come now. So obviously, what is it? 75% domestic resource. I think that's, in my view, the right way. As I was saying earlier on, if you raise resources domestically, then it gives you a lot of fiscal space and policy space, which means you can spend more on the productive capacity building that I was talking about. Why? Because ODA tends to go to the social sector. This has been the pattern because donors determine where the ODA should go. Usually, I think it's around 70 or so plus % of ODA goes mainly to the social sector, which is okay. I mean, developing education and health and humanitarian type of support is also needed. But the finance needed to develop your production capability and product capacity has to come from somewhere. So most of the domestic resource mobilization should be directed to building product capacity. This is one recommendation. We've been asked to suggest 3. On FDI, of course, countries cannot afford not to attract FDI. So the problem is not FDI. The problem is what it does once it's in your country. Therefore, in that respect, I think it's important as a recommendation to strengthen the transfer pricing regulations. This has been talked about a lot, but very little has been done. And reviewing also, as I say, these very generous tax incentives and clamping down on illicit financial flows, which I believe is going to be discussed this afternoon, which is a very important point. My third area is the debt issue. And
we only have 1 minute for you.
Okay. So I finish?
Please continue, half a minute.
No, I was saying, say that the same with debt, which is really heavy now in African countries. The problem is not borrowing, the problem is what you do with the money. So I would say that a lot of the debt should go to product capacity so that generates capability for countries to pay back their debt. Thank you.
Nagesh, in 2 minutes.
I take from where Tess left. I think issue of financing is very important, clearly. And Africa and other low-income countries need a lot of external finance also, on top of whatever can be mobilized within the countries. And in that context, in the Indian presidency of G20, an independent expert group co-chaired by Larry Summers of United States and N.K. Singh of India was set up, of which Ms. Vera Songwe was a member, Nick Stern was a member, many other very distinguished people were members. They have come up with two sets of reports, and one of in their key recommendation is that MDBs need to be reformed to have 3 times lending as they do now. Because the context was that poorer a country and the greatest need of a poorer country, the private flows that go to them, their terms are more onerous than those that go to more richer countries. So the countries which need these resources most are less likely to get them on the right terms. So in that context, expanding the capacity of MDBs, the multilateral development banks, African Development Bank or World Bank and all others, needs to be expanded, which allows for expanded flow of resources to countries in African continent and other low-income countries. I also agree with the tests on FDI. It is not enough to get FDI, but higher quality of FDI. So I stop. I think that is a very important point. So we should not just look at more FDI, but quality of FDI through some incentives, directing it to manufacturing capability building or services capability building. Thank you.
Yeah, it's unfair that our session is limited to 1 hour and 15 minutes. So we'd have learned a lot of insights from our panelists. Let's go back to the interactive, let's look at the result. The question number 2. Great, so let me give you one data of 2022. This data shows that revenue as source of financing in Africa was 73%. Remittance was 12%. ODA was 10%. FDI was 5%. On the FDI side, Africa's accounts only attracts 3.3% of global FDI. And if we may continue before going to Q&A to the last interactive, the question is, how should productive transformation policies and macroeconomic, let's move to the next question, interactive, the last one. Yeah. And how should productive transformation policies and macroeconomic policies work to produce the desired structural transformation, which is the central part of the theme of this year. So there are 3 options. Great, now we can open for Q&A. We have about 30 minutes maximum. Richard.
Thank you. Excellent panel. A couple of questions, really. You've all drawn a parallel with Asian success, but particularly East Asian success. When we did the research on the East Asian miracle, one of the major sources of domestic resource mobilization that none of you have talked about is profits. Because the success of East Asia was partly the fact that it not only had a high share of profits as part of income, but those profits were reinvested significantly. That was not a market story. It required an active state, a disciplining state, or a developmental state, what Alice Amsden a long time ago called reciprocal control mechanisms, as a necessary part of the toolkit available to policymakers to be able to ensure a kind of virtuous circle between high profits, investment, productivity growth, expanding markets. I don't see a lot of that in Africa. And I'd just like you to reflect on why that kind of virtuous circle has not emerged as part of the domestic resource mobilization story. Second of all, not unrelated, what's the role of the WTO in your story? A lot of African policymakers have complained that the WTO has cut down on policy space. I think it's true. The WTO is now defunct, effectively. The US has killed the WTO as a disciplining institution, if you so wish. What are the opportunities, including through industrial policy, because the Americans couldn't have undertaken their industrial policy under existing WTO rules? What's the opportunities that are available to African policymakers as a consequence of the WTO no longer having the same disciplining impact that it did for the last 25 years? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I would suggest let's take 2-3 more questions, and then the panelists can choose which questions they will be picking. Yeah, Christoph.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. 2 questions. The first one on FDI, how to make it productive for the country. So typically for, you mentioned, tax holidays, could be in special economic zone with special tax regime, a special legal system, which make it very difficult for the local business to participate, to be integrated, to even compete. So how to make sure that FDI doesn't go to a bubble and actually a hermetic bubble, and actually there are some spillover for the local economy. And the second question would be for the opportunity in trade in services, what can African policymakers ensure that African country will benefit from the expected growth in trade in services? Thank you.
Questions? Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks to the panel. It was really incredibly interesting to listen to you. I have a question which may be niche, but which I think is quite fundamental, which is something that Mavis mentioned about the governance of global finance. And I will give you an example. The regulation of Basel, the regulation of much of the insurance sector, the regulation of the credit rating agencies, all of those are dominated by the big money center regulators. And the result is that there are all sorts of biases built into global regulation that make it very hard, for instance, for banks, commercial banks, to finance projects nowadays in Africa, certainly longer-term sustainable infrastructure projects, that make it very hard for insurance companies in Europe or in the US to allocate any money to, it's just less than 2% actually are allocated to projects in emerging markets, much less Africa, et cetera, et cetera. The question is, why is this happening? Why is global regulation not taking into account the voices, the interests of developing countries, generally in Africa in particular, and what can be done about that? And a sort of associated issue on another aspect of global finance is, why don't we see more sustained efforts to change voting powers in the global financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank? It's a very, very slow process. But there isn't that much oomph behind it. I don't see the Brazilian G20, for instance, pushing this point. I didn't see the Indian G20 chair pushing the global governance point in the way that I would have expected them to.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. Are there students from Mohammed VI Polytechnic University? I would give them priority if they are. Okay, and women participants, you are also invited. Great, let me give, yeah, you. Yeah, did you raise your hand? Yeah, please.
Thank you. Yes, a question also on kind of how to export dynamics. I think one part of the East Asian success was also the exchange rate policy. At stable exchange rates often maybe undervalued or fair value. There's a lot of difficulties to have that in many African countries and to devalue because it's inflationary, because it can create pressures on foreign debt. So what would be your advice on this to trigger structural transformation?
Okay, final question.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. And I'm very happy that you talked at a certain point about the value chains and the regional value chains in Africa. In the African Agriculture Trade Monitor that we work on, every year we focus on a specific value chain. And I agree with you that it was very surprising that most of the products are exported unprocessed and then we import them processed on the one hand, in addition to the inputs that are imported from non-African countries, despite the fact that we can have some complementarity at the regional level. And I think there are two main issues, and I just want to have your input on that. First, I think there is an issue related to connectivity and logistics, because, for instance, it's easier to export or to import between, I don't know, Zimbabwe and France than between Zimbabwe and Tunisia, for instance. On the one hand, and on the other, the issue of, I agree also with my colleague who talked about trade and services, to what extent services also, they matter for the regional value chains of both the agriculture and the industrial sector. Because we know with the servicification of the industrial sector and the manufacturing sector in general, such services might be also relevant and valid for the agriculture sector. So from your perspective, what would be first the role of international organizations in terms of those that can invest or those that can govern in general these two issues? And especially to what extent it's important also to focus on the financing of infrastructure to improve the logistics within Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Some are contribution and some are questions. The panelists, you can pick the questions you would like to respond. So let me start with Tess. Yeah, just the questions you want to pick.
Okay. Thank you very much. These are all excellent questions. Very quickly, may go some of them, and the others will be answered by the panelists. Richard was mentioning the profit investment nexus. Of course, in Asia, that was absolutely critical. It was influenced by policy, as he was rightly saying, government policy, which basically means that many companies reinvested their profit into their company for expansion within the same area or sector or another sectors. And this was a very important source of financing in the East Asian economies. And the policy, again, mattered. That was very important. Now, it's not happening in Africa because a lot of the FDI that comes, as you know, FDI doesn't come to developed countries. FDI comes for profit, for business. And one of the deals they have to make is that whenever they wish to, the profit has to be repatriated. I guess companies coming from abroad also, they have their own shareholders, they're accountable. In fact, now, a lot of the debt many African countries have, a significant proportion of that external debt is actually financed to be repatriated as profit from companies, but countries cannot provide the foreign exchange, so it's counted as debt. I know for sure, for example, in my own country, Ethiopia, they have about 28 billion now external debt. And some proportion of it, 7+ billion of it, is apparently debt occurred to companies operating in the country that wish to repatriate their profits, but couldn't because the country doesn't have foreign exchange, and they're waiting until enough foreign exchange is obtained for them to expatriate. So the opposite is happening, in other words, Richard, which is really very sad because saving rate is already low, and if companies are not investing their profit, then where is it going to come, the additional investment? On the WTO issue, Richard, you're right. Whatever the WTO did was to narrow the policy space. Like, for example, local contact requirements is not allowed, so you cannot ask companies to source locally, because that's now banned by WTO. The subsidy on agriculture and also related to intellectual property rights, very restrictive TRIPS agreement that limits policy space. However, in Africa, out of the 54 countries, 33 of them are least developed countries. This is a UN category. If you are not familiar with it, there are 45 least developed countries in the world. 33 of them are in Africa. Now, these least developed countries are not subject to WTO restrictions. They have a waiver. And yet, they are not able to use that policy space. Again, I go back to what I was talking about, because they have limited product capacity. LDCs can export duty-free any products they can produce. But except Bangladesh and maybe Laos and one or two other countries like Cambodia, most African countries are not using it, the duty-free, quota-free market access, because they don't have many products they produce. So we go back to the productive capacity issue. Ability to produce goods and services is very, very important. And that also, I guess, linked to the trade and services issue. Let me very quickly. Now the AFCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, has just come up with digital trade, a protocol that focuses on digitally deliver services, which is opening markets within Africa. Unfortunately, in Africa, it's very, very low. I think about $33 billion export in services so far. And 3 countries dominated: Morocco, Ghana, and the third one is South Africa. 50% of it is from these countries. Other countries still developing. Services generally is a large proportion of their domestic output in many countries. Some countries up to 57% is services, and others on average about 40 to 50%. However, in terms of global export, it's less than 1%. In fact, 0.9% of global export in services come from Africa. Why? Because a lot of services is non-tradable. Low value, low productivity services, hotels, restaurants, and hairdressers, and so on. It's that kind of activity. The tradable type, high value, more sophisticated services haven't developed yet. They're beginning to develop. That's the problem. I don't want to take a lot of time for the others to share. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. No, I also like to begin with Richard's questions. You were right, in East Asia, the redeployment of profits has been a very important factor. And I see that happening also in some of the companies which invested in other countries, like Suzuki Motors in India, has built up a huge capital base by redeploying their profits. So Japanese have brought this practice from Japan to even India. And I think this is a very good model for any developing country to build up the productive capacity by reinvesting. And maybe governments can offer some incentives, tax breaks for redeployment of profits. Your second point about WTO regulatory framework getting into kind of a defunct mode with the appellate body not being provided or functioning. I think this is something of an opportunity for developing countries that want to use the policy space that was taken away, especially in TRIPS agreement, the local content requirements and all. What comes to my mind is that in 2014-15, when India tried to use local content requirements on solar panel manufacturing we were taken to the dispute settlement board by some countries which are now aggressively using these same in IRA, US is using domestic content requirements. So it's a very good time to retrieve that and use that policy space which was lost in the Uruguay round, and because until this appellate body reform happens, you can repeal, you can appeal to that, but it will be appeal in the void or something. So it should be made use of. The point about FDI and whether it will create bubbles, I think FDI, unlike the short-term capital flows or portfolio flows, is of a longer-term nature. And so it comes and stays there, helps in building capacity. But the concern that we were expressing in this panel was that many of these FDIs come for just extractive purposes, taking the resources, mine them, and take it away. So the idea is that host governments to incentivize the value addition in the country rather than just minerals being sucked out. And that is where the creative policy solutions, incentives based on value addition would be very helpful. And my final point is about your question, sir, about the credit rating and the reform of multilateral development banks going very slowly. It is indeed because of resistance of some of the larger shareholders to give up the power, the veto powers that they hold. And so it has to be, going like this. But I think the important thing is that the process which started in Indian presidency of G20 with this report, of which one co-chair was from United States, is on the table. And for next 2 years, this year and next year, G20 presidency will still be with the South. So Brazil has an opportunity to push the reform agenda which has been tabled in that report. Unfortunately, the second part of the report came after the summit happened. So it could not be really addressed by the last summit of G20. But this year, Brazil and next year, South Africa have the opportunity to push this reform, which is on the table in a very forceful manner. And this is the kind of opportunity that successively 3 developing countries, or actually 4 from Indonesia onwards, chairing the G20, an influential forum on global reforms of financial architecture. This kind of opportunity will not present itself for next 20 years. So we should really make use of it. Thank you.
So very quickly, 3 points. On the FDI in a bubble point, I think the fundamental challenge here we have is a lack of progression of policy. So a lot of the policies and systems that were put in place and infrastructure, putting FDI in bubbles, were put there because African countries did not have the policy frameworks, the infrastructure frameworks, etc., to attract FDI. Africa has moved on, but the policies have not changed. So I think that's where we are stuck at the moment. On the point around, Hans-Peter, your question around global financial architecture and why we are stuck, I think we are stuck for 3 reasons. Reason number 1 is domestic. As a region, we are not always united in our ask. And unless we stay united in our ask, we will always be played against each other. The stop-start will happen. And I think that's number 1. We've got to keep the momentum on our 5 asks, and we shouldn't relax when we see a little bit of progress in SDRs, a seat at the IMF, some tweaking at the bank. We shouldn't just comfortable. We should just keep pushing. So that's the first one. The second thing is that we are caught in geopolitics. We all know about the quota system. For us to get another seat, US has to give. If US gives, China gains, okay? Neither US or China are against us having a seat. But the problem is nobody's willing to make that first move to give us that additionals. So these are some of the, we are caught in between, and this is where how we navigate our space in the G20 becomes really important. And the third one is actually, I would say, us as global citizens and think tanks and civil society players. We jump on these bandwagons. And right now the big thing is IDA. And IDA will finish, and then the next big thing will be the ADF. And then that will finish, and then we'll go to the next big thing. We don't have a long-term, clear plan that we are aligned behind, that we are pushing for, and I think that's why this stop-start, because it will be a real shame if after India and South Africa, we get to a not-so-great next G20, which will remain nameless, and we don't pick it up when the opportunity arises again. And then your point on the regional value chains, I agree with you. Infrastructure is critical. Infrastructure on the continent remains outward looking and insufficiently connected. We talk about connectivity, but we don't have the money to do it effectively. So for me, one of the things we are pushing at Asset is if we pick value chains and we build connectivity around those value chains, there will be spillover effect. And as we make profits and we make money, we expand, etc. We can't do everything. So we need to do more analysis, acknowledging that there'll be winners and losers, but the losers will benefit at some stage, and we need to demonstrate that. That's the only way in which I think countries are going to agree. And very finally, is I fully agree with you on services. I think it was you that said that we have shifted from agriculture to low service industries. I get very frustrated every time a president or a minister of finance stands up and says that, oh, it's brilliant, we now have 90-something internet coverage. And then you look at what percentage is actually being used for productive use, it's less than 13%. Our service sector is not adding value to the real economy. So until we can do that, I agree with you, we will struggle. And before I hand over back to Arkebe, please, please, please come and try the chocolate before you go. There's lots for everyone.
Is it enough, the chocolate?
Oh yeah, the bars are big.
Okay. Thank you so much. And we are just on time. And I feel if we go back to the interactive charts, the final one. Yeah, this really shows a common consensus evolving. And as you could see, it highlights the need for focusing on productive transformation and also maximizing complementarity. Macroeconomy cannot ignore it. It's absolutely essential. But the way they are connected is absolutely important. So to highlight the three takeaways from my perspective and what we learned from our panelists, distinguished panelists, is the need to focus on productive transformation, specifically on promoting productive capacity, export capability, and economic diversification. And when we say productive capability, we are not only looking manufacturing. Manufacturing is important, but we also need to work on agriculture, transformation of agriculture, and high-value tradable services. And one important example in this is Morocco. Morocco's automotive industry is exemplar where many African countries can learn. It has boosted its export capability. Its local value addition has increased over 60%, and it has created jobs. And the issue will be how can we multiply and replicate such processes. On the financial resources, I want to highlight the consensus emerging, the need to focus on domestic resources. But domestic resources to play important role, the pie has to be bigger. You cannot milk taxes from people who are barely surviving to support their family. It means we need higher growth, the growth like the Asian countries. So high growth is absolutely important if we want to increase domestic resources. I prefer to combine remittance with domestic resources. Then we also need to say productive investment is going to be critical, as we have seen the automotive industry in Morocco. And the issue is, how do we create ecosystem? How do we create the environment to attract and also to promote this productive investment? Lending is not bad, we have to understand. The global lending in total is 300% of global GDP. And even the public lending globally is 100% of existing GDP, close to 100 trillion. So lending is not bad, but lending is bad when there is no growth, when there is no export, when there is no potential for exchange, because to support high growth, you need to also increase financing resources. And this is what we have learned, but we must highlight and we must fight that the international governance system is transformed, not just reformed, but transformed, because the current system undermines developing countries, weakens Africa and other developing countries. Thank you so much, everyone. Organizers, any announcement?
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now take a 15-minute